Every neighborhood has that one group of self-appointed enforcers. In this particular lakeside community, the homeowners association had taken things to a level that blurred the line between neighborly oversight and outright intimidation. Instead of friendly reminders or quiet warnings, the HOA here had established a compliance patrol, a rotating set of volunteers dressed in security-style uniforms, complete with radios, belts, and the illusion of authority. They weren't real law enforcement, but they carried themselves as if they were. At the head of this patrol was Mark, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for only a few years, but acted as though he owned every street, lawn, and driveway. Mark was the kind of person who thrived on control, who wanted everyone else to feel his presence. To him, being part of the HOA patrol was more than volunteer work. It was power, and he wielded it like a weapon. The confrontation began on an ordinary Saturday morning. The family at the center of this story, the Carters, had lived quietly in the neighborhood for years. They were respectful, kept their yard neat, and rarely had disputes. But the HOA had recently passed a new rule. No vehicles could be parked on the street overnight. The Carter's second car, an old SUV, had been parked curbside after a late night of unpacking from a trip. It was a small oversight, the kind any reasonable neighbor would overlook. But to Mark and his patrol, it was an act of defiance. That morning, while the Carter children played in the yard and the husband worked inside, Mark and two other HOA patrol officers marched down the street in their black polo shirts emblazoned with the HOA logo. They circled the SUV, snapping photos, jotting notes, and muttering to each other. The Carter wife, Lisa, stepped outside to see what the commotion was about. She was calm, polite, and curious, but as soon as she asked why they were there, Mark's demeanor shifted. Instead of explaining the violation, he puffed up with authority, declaring the SUV was a repeat offense, and that fines would be issued immediately. Lisa tried to reason with him, reminding them it had only been parked overnight once, but Mark wasn't interested in reason. He wanted compliance, and more importantly, submission. His words became sharper, his tone louder, until the neighbors began to notice. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open. A crowd started to form in quiet observation. What happened next stunned everyone. One of the patrol members, emboldened by Mark's aggression, placed his hand on what appeared to be a holstered weapon at his side. These weren't supposed to be armed men, yet this one carried what looked like a sidearm. The gesture alone sent a ripple of fear through the watching neighbors. And then, in a moment that crossed every line imaginable, he unholstered it. The patrol member didn't fire, but he pointed the weapon toward Lisa, shouting about compliance and consequences. The sight of a gun aimed at a mother in her own front yard froze the entire street. The neighbors gasped, children cried, and even Mark looked shocked at the escalation. But Lisa did not flinch. She stood straighter, her eyes cold, her movements calm. Most people would panic, plead, or retreat in terror when faced with a drawn weapon. But Lisa Carter was not most people. What the HOA patrol didn't know, what not even most of her neighbors knew, was that Lisa wasn't just a suburban mother. She was a highly decorated Navy SEAL tactical trainer, someone who had spent years teaching America's elite forces how to disarm, de-escalate, and survive the most dangerous combat scenarios. Her neighbors had always known her as the friendly woman who hosted block parties and helped with school fundraisers. The HOA saw her as just another resident to be pushed around. But at that moment, standing with a gun pointed at her chest, Lisa revealed a calmness and control that no ordinary person could muster. She didn't lunge. She didn't scream. Instead, she measured every move, every breath, in ways that only someone with years of tactical training could. Her calm unnerved the patrol instantly. The one holding the gun began to waver, his grip tightening nervously, his bravado slipping. Even Mark seemed uncertain, glancing between Lisa and his reckless partner. The neighborhood, once buzzing with whispers, fell into dead silence. Everyone could feel that something monumental had just shifted. Lisa Carter wasn't prey. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't even afraid. And in that silence, the realization was beginning to take root. The HOA patrol had just made the worst mistake of their lives. By the next morning, word about the incident spread to the neighborhood like wildfire. Some neighbors sided with the HOA cops, believing they'd acted bravely to protect the community. Others, however, were horrified by the fact that guns had been drawn on a woman in her own driveway. What most didn't know was that this wasn't just any woman. She had spent years as a tactical trainer for Navy SEALs, teaching some of the toughest men alive how to stay calm, precise, and lethal in combat. Her husband knew that she had been holding back the previous night. She could disarm both men in a matter of seconds. But she also knew that if she had done so, the situation could have spiraled into something deadly and irreversible. Instead, she chose discipline over force, a decision rooted in her years of service. That choice, however, didn't mean she was going to let it slide. The HOA security team doubled down on their stance. They filed an official complaint accusing her of noncompliance and threatening behavior. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had drawn weapons on her, yet she was being painted as the aggressor. The report circulated among the board members, and soon whispers of banning her family from the community pool, gym, and other amenities began to surface. It wasn't about, but she wasn't the type to be intimidated by paper threats or gossip. That evening, she started gathering evidence. She set up discreet cameras around her property, collected testimonies from supportive neighbors, and began documenting every interaction with the HOA. Her calmness wasn't weakness. It was a preparation of someone who had been through real battles and knew that the best strikes came after patience and planning. Meanwhile, the two men who pulled the guns tried to maintain their tough image. They strutted around the neighborhood in their security uniforms, a cheap attempt at authority, though everyone knew they were nothing more than self-appointed enforcers. But the bravado started to crack. People began questioning their story. Why had they escalated so quickly? Why had they felt the need to pull firearms on an unarmed resident? Their narrative had holes, and her quiet confidence made them nervous. Days later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. Tensions were high as residents crowded in, curious to see what would unfold. The board tried to present their version of events, framing her as a dangerous woman who posed a risk to the neighborhood. But when it was her turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice or argue. Instead, she laid out the facts. She showed video recordings of the confrontation, evidence that she had been calm while the so-called cops escalated to violence. The room shifted. Murmurs spread as people realized the truth. The image of her as a threat began to crumble, replaced by the reality that the HOA security team had crossed a line. But the board wasn't ready to give up control. They argued back, insisting that her past as a military trainer made her dangerous and unpredictable. It was a desperate attempt to twist her strength into something sinister, but she remained steady, like she had trained countless soldiers to be. The HOA had underestimated her, not just her skills, but her patience, intelligence, and ability to rally support. This wasn't over. In fact, the real battle was only beginning, because while the board tried to play politics, she was preparing to dismantle their authority piece by piece, using the same discipline and strategy that had once trained Navy SEALs for missions around the globe. The HOA thought they were facing just another homeowner. What they didn't realize was that they had picked a fight with someone who had made a career out of winning wars without firing a single shot. And now, she was ready to strike back. The HOA thought their authority was unshakable, but they hadn't planned for someone who understood tactics better than any of them ever could. Within days, she filed formal complaints with the city, citing misuse of firearms, harassment, and violation of community bylaws. She knew exactly where to hit them: paperwork, legal codes, and exposure. The HOA's board members might have been used to bullying regular homeowners, but now they were under the microscope of actual law enforcement. Behind the scenes, she coordinated with neighbors who had also suffered under the HOA security team. Stories of intimidation, threats, and false fines surfaced. People who had been silent out of fear now felt empowered to speak. One by one, testimony stacked against the board, painting a picture of corruption and unchecked aggression. The so-called cops who pulled a gun on her were no longer symbols of authority. They were liabilities dragging the HOA into the dirt. The tipping point came when local news got wind of the story. A resident leaked video footage of the incident, showing the armed men confronting her while she stood calm and unflinching. The clip went viral. Reporters framed it as HOA vigilantes pull guns on unarmed woman, and the outrage spread beyond the neighborhood. Suddenly, the board was scrambling, facing pressure not only from residents but from the public eye. At the next HOA meeting, the clubhouse was packed to capacity. Residents demanded answers. The board tried to deflect, insisting that their security measures were for everyone's safety. But their excuses fell flat. The video was undeniable. And then she stood up, no shouting, no theatrics, just controlled authority. She explained who she was, her years of training elite soldiers, and the discipline it took to stand down when others escalated. She reminded the room that her choice to stay calm wasn't weakness. It was restraint. Her words hit harder than any weapon. Neighbors applauded, some even standing to show support. The tide had turned. The cops were stripped of their titles, facing investigation for reckless endangerment. The HOA president, realizing their control was slipping, resigned under pressure. By the end of the month, new elections were held. This time, residents voted in people who valued safety, fairness, and transparency. The toxic power structure collapsed, and for the first time in years, the community began to breathe freely. As for her, she never once bragged or gloated. She simply returned to her life, quietly proud that she had defended her family and her home without violence. To her, it wasn't about winning a fight. It was about teaching a lesson. True strength is not in pulling a trigger, but in having the discipline not to. The HOA had tried to make her the villain. Instead,